Okay. Thank you everybody for making the time today to come to the first of our 3 series of systemic racism in Canada. And this is a series that we've worked together with Kerry Cavers from Mums Against Racism, who's done some brilliant workshops for us in the past. And we've put these together specifically to look at how we can talk about anti-racism in our community organizing. So welcome. This is going to be a really great session, and we hope that you can join all 3. And this first one is about going over some of the history that we need to know. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. First thing is we are trialing for the first time ever to offer this workshop in French. And I hope that is going to be of interest to some people. Do let us know if you're going to be listening in French. And what you need to do is go to the interpretation button, which is along the bottom toolbar, and then click French. And then from this point on, you'll hear Kerry very quietly in the background, but you'll hear Marie-Paul, who's going to be interpreting in French clearly. And what you can do is you can spotlight Marie-Paul so you can see your interpreter, and then you can listen in French. So let us know if you're having any tech issues with that, but we're going to be giving that a go for the first time today, which is super exciting. Okay, I'll move on. Thank you everyone for coming to this training session. It's really great to see such good numbers here. And I think we've got a really broad spectrum of representation from all our teams, which is really cool. For those of you that this is the first time at a For Our Kids event, welcome. For Our Kids is a parent-led network of volunteers, and we're here to take climate action for our kids and our grandkids. And if this is your first time, you can get to know us, and we've got plenty of other events like this and ways to get involved. I think we're going to put some links in the chat. Yep, perfect. So maybe just to get started, if everyone could just put their name in the chat along with where they are today and one emoji to just tell us how you're feeling, what your vibe is as you're joining this session. And if you're not sure on your Indigenous territories, we're going to put in a link of where you can find that as well. So we'll just do that as a quick intro. And I'm going to pass over, as I say, we're trying to squeeze a lot into this next hour. So I'm going to pass over now to Kerry. So we're really, really grateful to have Kerry Cavers run this session for us this morning. And Kerry is the founder and president of Mums Against Racism. So she's going to be going through a lot of material in the next hour. There's 2 points, I think, where we're going to pause for questions. So if you can just hold your questions for those moments. But if you want to put any other reactions or thoughts in the chat, you're more than welcome. If you just want to share things with the group. Okay, so now I'm really happy to pass over to Kerry, and Kerry's going to go through all the introductions and the land acknowledgements. And thank you so much, Kerry.
Thank you so much, Lorna. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Systemic Racism in Canada, the history that parents need to know. My name is Kerry Cavers. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the founder of Mums Against Racism Canada. I am biracial, Black presenting, cisgender woman, mom to 3 littles, and I'm also neurodivergent with a late in life discovery of ADHD. I have Swedish, Irish, and English ancestry on my mom's side, and African ancestry on my dad's side, most likely from Mali and Nigeria. But thanks to colonization and enslavement, I'm still trying to figure out that history for myself. And I am shorter, not that that matters virtually. And I also have a medium brown skin tone and long black and gray curly hair. So thank you so much to Natalie and Lila for inviting me to come back and speak to your group about such an important topic. To do the great work that you are doing with For Our Kids, it's critical to understand how racism and colonial power structures impact our lives and contribute to the degradation of our planet. and the work that we do is intertwined. So a couple of housekeeping bits before we get started. I love cameras on, so please feel free to have your camera on if that works for you. I also recognize that having your camera on may be distracting for some as you worry about what your face is saying. So if that is you, please feel free to have your camera off. I also know that this is can be prime kiddo time, and some of you may be doing double duty. So that's totally cool with me too. Just know that I will be moving quickly through the material, and you may miss things if you're not able to be fully present, but that's your call. And as Lorna said, there will be a couple of opportunities to share throughout the session, and I welcome you to share out loud or via the chat. You can just raise your virtual hand if you'd like to share, and then please say your name before you speak so we know who we're having a conversation with. And then if you do have any questions that are not covered by the material, please make a note of it, and then we'll have some time at the end for a lot of questions. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us and for approaching this discussion with an openness and curiosity and desire to learn. So let's start today's session by shaking hands with our hearts and grounding us in a place of responsibility and gratitude. Now, the image on the slide is of a beautiful white sandy bay lined with homes in an area colonially referred to as Gonzales Beach or Gonzales Bay, and is land that was home to the Chilkowich tribe. So I am personally still searching for its traditional name, but this is the medicine that I benefit from as a guest on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And this is just a few blocks from my home. And so on emotionally heavy days, I will walk down to the beach and just sit and listen to the waves rolling in and rolling out, taking with it what was weighing me down. And these waters are sacred waters. And so it is with immense gratitude that I acknowledge and honor the loving relationship the Songhees and Esquimalt nations had and have with this area from time long beyond memory. Now, I have so much still to learn and relationships to build, but I am committed to being a good guest and supporting Lekwungen voices as they know how to care best for these lands. And the beauty of being virtual is that we can join this session from many different areas. And so there are many examples of nations, bands, and Indigenous communities reclaiming culture, governance, language, and so much more. So as a part of your learning journey, I encourage you to research and explore what the local nation or nations are doing in your area and what you can do to support those efforts. So, okay, I am going to be honest with you. The material that we are discussing today may be difficult and sometimes triggering. So while I do take care to share this information in a way that is most accessible, racism is a hard topic, one that is emotionally charged for many. And if you haven't had the practice of processing the emotions that can come up when we're talking about race and white supremacy, you may experience this discussion as accusatory or attacking. I want to assure you that it's not. It is just the truth of the matter. So if you find yourself getting activated, so feeling angry or defensive, please just take a moment to breathe and remind yourself why you're here. If you need to, take some extra deep breaths or turn your camera off and you can let the tears come too. If you do find yourself getting activated, if you need some additional support processing the material after this session, there are some resources available to assist you. I have on the screen a list of a few, and then I did find another link that I think is going to get posted in the chat that has more Canada-wide resources, and you may know of others too. So this information will be sent in a follow-up email in case you would like it as well. So please take care of yourself. So to make our time together a safer, brave space for learning and unlearning, we're going to use these group agreements to create some compassionate boundaries that will guide our engagement today. So hopefully they will also help us step out of our comfort zone into a place of learning and growth. So these were sent out ahead of time for you to review. Are there any additional agreements anyone would like to add that would help make this space feel safer so that we can be braver? And I will just check the chat. Okay, I don't see anything, so fantastic. Thank you all for keeping these agreements close to your heart as we move through the material today. So let's take a moment to review what we will be doing in the next hour. So we will examine the concepts of racialization, racialized, and colonialism. We're going to highlight the relation between colonization and racism. We're going to review historical to present day examples of racism in Canada. We're going to understand the racial impacts of colonization and then make a commitment to do some further learning and take reparation action. Now, while this session provides a cursory overview of colonization and the history of racism in Canada, our goal today is to provide some context and learning outcomes that give us all a basic and common understanding of racism, anti-racism, and how systemic racism came to be in Canada. So our other workshops like Anti-Racism 101, which is ideally taken before this session, or addressing racism in your organization or using your power and privilege to dismantle racism, they provide more in-depth learning on topics such as the concept of race, racism, white supremacy, and anti-racism, the four main types or categories of racism, how to be an upstander, the concepts of tokenism, microaggressions, and emotional labor, what to do when we've caused harm, power and privilege, the concepts of white fragility, white exceptionalism, and intersectionality, the difference between allyship and accomplishment, and strategies to dismantle systemic racism to achieve racial justice. So are there any burning questions at this moment before we begin? Okay, everybody's ready. Let's go. So there are and have been many ways other than BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, or person of color, or POC, person of color, to refer to melanated people or people with melanated ancestors. There has been non-white minorities, visible minorities, but these and some others, they center whiteness and make BIPOC people the other. So some alternative ways that are more BIPOC centering are Black or brown people. However, this does not fit for all BIPOC people though. There's people of the global majority, and there's racialized. So racialization is assuming people behave in a certain way because of their race. It's the process of attaching traits and attitudes to people based on racial bias. So it reduces people to a stereotype and denies who they are as an individual. At its core, it's dehumanizing and thus violent in nature. Racialized is the result of the racialization process. And it's a title used to describe non-white people existing as a separate category of people in the white dominant society. And currently there's no right way or unanimously preferred option to refer to melanated people. There are harmful things about all of them. So wise practice is to always be as specific as you can or mirror the language used by the person or group that you're referring to. So most people use BIPOC or racialized. I use racialized, like marginalized, as the endings ization and ized indicate that something external forced this on them, meaning that the concept of race and all the negatives associated with it have been assigned to people of color. It has been done to them. Which brings us to the definition of racism. So racism is a system of oppression and a system of advantage based on race. And it involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of our society by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. So racism is different from racial prejudice. It is racial prejudice plus social and institutional power. Now, racism as a system inequitably distributes opportunity, benefits, and resources across ethnic or racial groups. So as individuals, we participate in this system by either upholding its structure, aka maintaining the status quo, or we are actively working to change it, aka being anti-racist. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, why and how did such an inequitable system take hold if it was based on a false scientific premise of biological superiority? And the answer is colonialism. So colonialism is the system by which colonizers, who are groups of people or countries, come to a new country and steal the land and resources from the indigenous peoples, develop a set of laws and processes designed to violate their human rights, violently suppress their governance, legal, social, and cultural structures, and force them to conform with the structures of the colonial state. And it's important to remember or to recognize and remember that in Canada, Indigenous peoples refers to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but globally speaking, Indigenous peoples refers to the first inhabitants of the land. And this means that the act of colonization has occurred and currently is occurring all over the world. So for more information, I highly recommend reading the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the European colonial project to create the Atlantic world began in earnest in 1492. And at its foundation, the project involved two violent processes. So, number one, dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their lands in the Americas. And number two, dehumanizing Africans trafficked across the Atlantic to labor on plantations as slaves. So simply put, in order for colonizers to effectively steal the land and resources from Indigenous people and use non-white folks to do the back-breaking labor to settle the land, they needed a justifiable and marketable reason for why they could commit atrocious acts like genocide, enslavement, forced labor, and internment. So by classifying racialized people as less intelligent, morally corrupt, and genetically built for hard labor, colonizers were able to rationalize their strategy to take the land and be profitable by whatever means necessary. And the current manifestations of racism that we see today have strong roots in a multi-century, actively racist, violent colonial project. So before we go further, I would like to provide a care warning or a trigger warning. During the following section, we will be discussing 13 historical racist events and some additional impacts that may be disturbing, even traumatizing to some of you. So if you feel the need to step away or leave the session altogether, please do what is best for you and take care of yourself. You're likely going to experience feelings like anger, fear, sadness, grief, shame, or even rage. They are all very natural feelings while learning about this. If you can, try your best to stick with it and sit in the uncomfortable. You gotta get uncomfortable to be able to grow through this. Also, please reach out to a trusted friend or one of the support services to talk it through after the session. You don't need to process this on your own. So the first set of events that we will be looking at all take place prior to or just after our nation officially became the country Canada in 1867. So on this slide, we have a timeline of racist historical events starting in the 1600s, going up to 1947. It's important to mention that each of these examples of racism from our Canadian history could easily be a full 90-minute discussion on their own. But the goal here with these quick snapshots of each example is to bring awareness to them in hopes that you will be curious and find out more information on your own. I will be sending out an email with some suggestions of resources that you can explore following this workshop. Or Natalie or Lala will be. So obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you an idea of how colonization and racism were foundational to the creation of Canada. And these are just a few of many examples I could have chosen to highlight. So we'll start first with mission schools, transatlantic slave trade, residential schools, Canada Day, the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police, the Indian Act, and the CPR, Chinese head tax, and immigration exclusion. So if you were like me and completely zoned out at school, learning Canada's geography in the 16, 17, and 1800s, here's a quick refresher for you that might provide some helpful context. So prior to us having all the provinces and territories like we do, we had areas like New France and Lower and Upper Canada and Rupert's Land. So the names and boundaries would change when Britain conquered New France. So the important thing to understand as we review these historical contexts is French and British Europeans arrived by boat on the East Coast, primarily claiming that area, and it was referred to as New France or Lower and Upper Canada, depending upon the time. The Hudson's Bay Company and the fur traders claimed the area referred to as Rupert's Land. Okay, let's get into it. So the Doctrine of Discovery was issued in 1493, the year after Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of what is now referred to as North America. And it legitimized Christian explorers going to new lands and laying claim to them. If the lands were uninhabited by Christians, they were deemed vacant and could be discovered and claimed. To escape oppressive treatment in Europe, many Christians and Catholic people traveled to North America to make a new life under the Doctrine of Discovery. And in the early 1600s, mission schools for Indigenous children were established in New France or Lower Canada what it was named at the time, and ran them until the 1800s when the Government of Canada's residential school system took over. Schools were operated by Catholic missionaries from French religious orders, with Protestant churches later joining in. And the main objective of these mission schools were to civilize and Christianize Indigenous peoples. Then in 1628, African enslavement began in Canada with the first recorded person enslaved. A 6-year-old boy from Madagascar, brought to New France by the head clerk of the French colony. His French baptized name was Olivier Lejeune. Now, contrary to what a lot of us learned about slavery in Canada, New France did actively practice chattel slavery, meaning people were treated as personal property that could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited. Approximately 1,400 Black people were made slaves to French colonists in New France. After the American Revolution, the number of enslaved Africans in British North America significantly increased by around an additional 3,000 people. So enslavement in Canada would span 200 plus years until August 1st, 1834, when slavery was officially abolished. It should be noted that Canada didn't even abolish slavery itself, though. It was abolished by Britain and subsequently in Canada by extension. And many slave-owning Canadians at the time were not happy about that. So as we know, words matter. And when we're talking about slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the words we use help shape our understanding of what happened. So we must remember that colonizers didn't steal or kidnap slaves. They stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, fathers, mothers, children, etc., and made them slaves. It's important to refer to slavery as enslavement, and people being enslaved instead of slaves, to focus accountability on colonizers rather than attributing slavery to some failing of African people and their personhood. So from the 1600s to the 1800s, there was entrenched enslavement of Black people and the first iteration of residential schools for Indigenous children with the mission schools. Then enslavement was taken away from the colonizers and they lost their legally cheap labor. The mission schools were not being as effective as hoped, and the Indigenous people were not assimilating to a colonizer way of life. The Indigenous peoples were also not just handing over the land. So the federal government then began in the 1830s, in collaboration with settler churches and colonial governments, to establish residential schools. And the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement formally recognizes 139 schools across Canada, but that does not include any schools that were operating without federal support. So thanks to the courageous work of those involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we know approximately 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children were put in residential schools. And the TRC report estimated up to 6,000 children died at residential schools. In May 2021, the Tk'emlech-Deshwet'emek First Nation in Kamloops used ground-penetrating radar to locate the remains of 215 children in unmarked graves. Since then, several other Canadian residential school sites have been searched, and the child remains count is now into the thousands. And this is just the beginning of the unearthing. The last residential school closed in 1996. This means that you have friends, colleagues, community members who attended residential school or whose parents attended, and we cross paths with people directly impacted by the intergenerational trauma caused by these schools. So as we continue to reckon with this truth, it's important for those of us who want to be allies to understand that with each child that is uncovered, trauma is triggered throughout the Indigenous collective. And as an ally, we need to walk gently. So next, the colonizers began to work together to establish one new country to protect their interests. So the British Parliament passed the British North America Act, and the Dominion of Canada was officially born on July 1st, 1867. A couple of years later, the Hudson's Bay Company transferred Rupert's Land back to the Crown without consulting Indigenous peoples, of course. And then the land was then included in the new Dominion of Canada 3 years after Confederation, making way for settler colonialism in Western Canada. So July 1st was celebrated as Dominion Day up until 1982, when it changed to just Canada Day. So to extend their colonial control over Indigenous territories in the West, the Mounted Police Force for the Northwest Territories was created under the direction of Prime Minister John A. Macdonald. So later shortened to the Northwest Mounted Police, the NWMP was modeled after the Royal Irish Constabulary, which is a paramilitary police force that the British had used to keep the Irish under control. And that year, 150 recruits were sent to Manitoba under the guise of protecting the Indigenous people from unscrupulous whiskey traders. But in reality, they were there to deal with and discourage pushback from the Métis and First Nations people. So the NWMP was grown at exponential speed, doubling in size in a year. Then, just 10 years later, the force grew to 1,000 men, and the NWMP joined Canada's military forces in a war against different Métis, Cree, Assiniboine, and Saulteaux communities in the West. Afterwards, the police played a key role in forcibly relocating Indigenous peoples onto reserves to help clear the way for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, the title Royal was given to the Northwest Mounted Police by King Edward VII. And when Parliament voted to merge the Royal Northwest Mounted Police with the Dominion Police, which was the federal police force overseeing Eastern Canada, they became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on February 1st, 1920. So when reflecting upon the path to reconciliation, it's important to understand the RCMP's role as a colonial paramilitary force in its historical context, and that it was built specifically to be a tool of oppression of Indigenous peoples. Not unlike the Indian Act. So approximately 46 years after the first federally run residential school opened, and 9 years after the birth of Canada, the Indian Act was passed. So again, Indigenous people were not assimilating and giving up the land like the colonizers wanted them to, and residential schools were not working fast enough. So the government of Canada introduced new laws to control Indigenous peoples. They established ownership, or the Act, established ownership over Indigenous people and the land. So for example, the Act ensured if any new colonizers came, they had to negotiate directly with the Crown and not with Indigenous people. It also infantilized Indigenous people and aimed to strip away culture, language, and rights to force assimilation and push them into a position where the government would have unfettered access to the land and natural resources. The Act has been amended several times, most significantly in 1951 and 1985. It has enabled trauma, human rights violations, and social and cultural disruption for generations of Indigenous peoples, but it is also the only legislation that acknowledges Indigenous peoples' relation to the land. So doing away with it altogether is currently also problematic. So I highly recommend reading or listening to the audio version of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Chief Bob Joseph. It's both a heartbreaking and infuriating essential read to understand how the government of Canada systematically tried to strip away Indigenous sovereignty and identity. Okay. So now that Canada was established as one country, there needed to be a more efficient way to travel its expansive lands. And so the Canadian Pacific Railway, or the CPR, was incorporated in 1881 and was completed only 4 short years later. So it connected Eastern Canada to British Columbia and played an important role in the further development of Canada as a nation. So, with slavery abolished and Indigenous resistance happening across the land, the government needed a new pool of people to be used as cheap labor for this dangerous work. Enter Chinese temporary workers. As a way to save enough money to someday return to China and buy a small plot of land, approximately 15,000 Chinese temporary workers came to build the CPR, and they were paid $1 a day. And from this dollar, they had to pay for their food and their gear. White workers were paid double per day and did not have to pay for their provision. Now, once the railway was completed in 1885, Canada changed its immigration policy, implementing a $50 entry or head tax for Chinese migrants. So to put this in perspective, in today's dollars, they were earning about $30 a day on the railway, less their provisions, and the head tax would be equal to $1,400. So 5 years later, in response to anti-Asian racism pressure in British Columbia, the government further restricted Asian immigration by raising the head tax to $100, much to the dismay of BC politicians who demanded it be raised to $500. Then, the following year, the government appointed a royal commission on Chinese and Japanese immigration and did raise the head tax to $500. So that's $7,000 in today's dollars. Now, the head tax program proved not effective enough in restricting Chinese immigration long term. So in 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act was replaced with legislation by the same name that essentially suspended Chinese immigration altogether. The new act banned most Chinese immigrants from entering Canada unless they were merchants, diplomats, or a foreign student. And it wasn't until 1947 when the discriminatory legislation was finally repealed. So there's no getting around how Canada came to be. The actions, the policies, and the laws at the time were designed to create the Canada we know and which many of us benefit from today. And the information we just reviewed and this understanding of the foundation of our nation is contrary to the narrative many of us have been taught about Canada and its inclusiveness and multicultural identity. Coming to this understanding can shake people to their core. So right now, you may be feeling a little lost, but know that you're not alone. There are many people currently questioning the Canadian identity they knew and trying to reconcile all the great things there is to love about Canada with our shameful history. The good news is that there is a way forward. So before we get into the next 6 events, I want to take another moment to take a moment just to check in and see how people are doing. What questions you have, what was something you learned or that clicked for you, or put an emoji in the chat. Let us know how you're doing that way. So feel free to, in the chat, by typing an emotion word or sharing a thought, let us know how you're doing. Or perhaps as reviewed in our group agreements, this is a good time to practice that pause and it just be reflective of what's coming up for you. So I'm going to check the chat.
Sorry, I'm just doing a time check. Coming up to the last minutes.
Thank you. So we got angry, we got a sad face, appreciated the change in language from slaves to enslavement. That feels important moving forward. Tear face, sad face, broken heart. Feeling calm. There's not much that's new or shocking to me. However, I do worry. I have deep concerns about how our current education system whitewashes this history. Yeah, it's getting better, but well, in some places it's getting better. I see you're from Alberta, so that is one place where it's not getting better. So sorry about that. Okay. Let's keep going. Just, for anyone who might be feeling angry or scared or ashamed, just remember it's important to take time for deep breaths as we go through this content. Remember that feelings of shame or fear or anger are all part of the unlearning process. And it doesn't mean that you are a bad person. If we let ourselves sit in those feelings, though, our brain gets hijacked and we aren't able to take in any new information. So have a sip of water, stretch it out, take a couple of deep breaths, or do what works for you to help you calm your nervous system. Okay. So now that we've reviewed the making of Canada and how systemic discrimination and marginalization of non-European people is embedded into its foundation, let's look at some additional racist events in Canadian history that continue to shape the nation that we know today. So we're going to talk about the Komagata Maru, Japanese-Canadian internment, 60 Scoop, Africville, Hogan's Alley, and the Millennium Scoop. So white European settlers were still big mad about Asian immigration. And they feared immigration would allow Asia's large population to overrun Canada's west coast, and that the land that they stole would be stolen from them. So there was even race riots and anti-Asiatic parades taking place primarily in British Columbia. So in response, Canada passed the Continuous Passage Act, which required all immigrants to arrive directly from their point of origin with no stops in between. So this effectively said, we don't want non-white people, without actually saying that, because at that time, no passenger ship had the ability to make that distance. So the wealthy Sikh businessman Gurdeep Singh decided to challenge these discriminatory laws and personally chartered the Japanese steamship Komagata Maru, which had been converted from a coal ship to a passenger vessel, to take 376 South Asian Indian people leaving Japan to sail to Vancouver, BC. Now, word quickly reached Vancouver that the ship was on its way, and the local newspapers decried its arrival as a Hindu invasion. When the ship docked, it was immediately greeted by immigration officials who refused to let passengers disembark. The ship and all its passengers, with little supplies left, sat in the harbor for almost 2 months before being ordered to leave. So 125 Vancouver police officers and 35 special immigration agents even attempted to board the vessel, but were beaten back. A few days later, the naval cruiser HMCS Rainbow arrived, guns out, and the Komagata Maru was escorted out to sea and began its journey back to Calcutta. Upon its arrival back in India, 19 men were shot and killed, while many more were imprisoned. Now, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, Japan aligned themselves in World War II with Germany and Italy. Now, by default, Canada was at war with Japan. I would imagine the anti-Asian attitudes of the federal government at the time only helped to quicken Canada's response, because immediately after the bombing, Canadian officials in BC seized all fishing boats owned by Japanese Canadians, 1,800 in total. They also confiscated cameras and shortwave radios, shut down Japanese language newspapers and schools, and implemented a nightly curfew. A few weeks later, the federal government passed an order to remove all Japanese Canadian men between the ages of 18 and 45 from the BC coast, which was conveniently categorized as a protected zone. 90% of Japanese Canadians living in BC lived in this protected zone. Shortly after, the order was expanded to include all Japanese Canadians in the protected zone, resulting in approximately 23,000 men, women, and children forcibly being removed from their homes, despite over 75% of them being Canadian-born or naturalized citizens. So again, concerned about the growing Asian population, we rounded up and displaced thousands of Japanese Canadians, claiming that they were a potential threat to our national security, despite our own military and RCMP saying that they weren't. And so some 12,000 people were forced to live in the internment camps. About 700 men were also sent as prisoners of war to camps in Ontario. Another 4,000 or so people were sent to work on sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba to help fill labor shortages, kind of like enslavement. And then after the war ended, instead of allowing Japanese Canadians to return to their homes, we banned them from returning to BC. And about 4,000 were exiled to Japan, a now war-ravaged country many of them had never even been to. Now, not that there was anything for them to return to, as the government had sold off all of their land and possessions to finance the internment camps. And it wasn't until 4 years after the war ended that Japanese Canadians were again allowed to move freely across Canada. So, recapping the events we've reviewed thus far, we can see the common themes of colonization and white supremacy thinking of, we are better, we know better, and how we do things is better, and therefore we should have the best of everything. Now, this thinking and practice started with the first generation of settlers that arrived and was socialized as the way of the civilized. By the 1960s, approximately 14 generations later, this way of thinking became normalized in our society and embedded in all our institutional systems, to the point where the people working in these systems, like the child welfare system, honestly believed what they were doing was helpful or saving people. And it was this kind of thinking, along with the continued desire for authorities and large corporations to monopolize resources, that gave rise to and perpetuated the 60 Scoop. So the 60 Scoop refers to the fostering and adoption out of Indigenous children, primarily to white families, between the 1960s and mid-1980s. It was coined the 60 Scoop because many children were literally scooped from their homes and communities without the knowledge or consent of families, and the highest numbers of these adoptions took place in the 1960s. So two key changes happened in the 1950s to 60s that contributed to this. So first, the Indian Act was amended in 1951, giving provinces jurisdiction over the welfare of Indigenous children. Second, by the 50s and 60s, the federal government was beginning to close some of the residential schools because they were a financial strain. However, authorities still felt it was better for Indigenous children to assimilate. And since provincial governments didn't want to invest in improving child welfare in Indigenous communities that they were now responsible for, they instead just removed the children from their reserves and communities and put them with non-Indigenous families, sometimes even with families outside of Canada. So the 60 Scoop has caused a great erasure of culture, language, and familial ties for Indigenous people, and has resulted in so much trauma. Statistics from the Department of Indian Affairs show a total of 11,132 status Indian children were adopted out between the years of 1960 and 1990. However, many Indigenous children were not recorded as status, and therefore the actual numbers of stolen children are much higher than that. The next two events we will look at are Black communities that were thriving and then demolished by local government. The first is Africville, Nova Scotia, a culturally significant place on the East Coast for Black Canadians. And so Black settlers bought land there, raised their families, established a church, and eventually grew to approximately 400 residents. And it was a hub of Black community and belonging. Now, despite paying city taxes, the residents did not receive services such as paved roads, running water, or sewers. Instead, the city of Halifax placed undesirable services in Africville, including a fertilizer plant, slaughterhouses, a prison, a sewage dump, and the infectious diseases hospital. This is a prime example of environmental racism. Now, white Halifax residents referred to Africville as a slum built around the dump by scavengers, even though the dump had been built around Africville. And so this dehumanizing of the community played an important role in public acceptance of Africville's destruction. So despite Africville residents' objections, the Halifax City Council approved plans to rezone Africville to industrial lands, recommending that residents be rehoused to make way for industrial projects. Homes were bulldozed lot by lot over the next 5 years, sometimes without the homeowner's knowledge. And to add insult to injury, when the city organized moving company canceled, Halifax used dump trucks to move residents and their possessions instead. So not surprisingly, the city's relocation plans did not adequately support Africville residents. Displaced residents found that what they were paid for their home and land was not even enough for a down payment on a new home, and they were unable to find employment in town as many companies refused to hire Black people. So those who stayed in Halifax were forced into the welfare system, while others left for Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg. What is Africville now? Not an industrial complex, but amongst other things, private housing and a dog park.
Mary, I'm just doing a quick time check. We're down to 5 more minutes.
Okay. There's a chance that we might end up going a few minutes over. Just we'll do another time check after this slide. So Hogan's Alley on the West Coast is the second Black community that was destroyed by local government. Hogan's Alley was a historically Black neighborhood in Vancouver that was home to one of Canada's biggest communities of Black Canadians from the 1900s to 1960s, reaching over 800 residents at its peak. As discriminatory housing laws and practices pushed Black people out of other areas, Hogan's Alley became densely populated with Black Canadians, as well as many other racialized communities. And this close community gave rise to a thriving arts and jazz scene. It was home to Nora Hendrix, Jimi Hendrix's grandmother, and brought many big names to visit, such as Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, and Sammy Davis Jr. Now, despite being this vibrant community culture, just like Africville, the area was labeled as a slum by city officials, and this justified the need for an urban renewal project. Also, just like Africville, the city's plan was more an attempt to keep Black Canadians apart and to erase their history and culture by erasing Vancouver's largest Black community. By 1972, Hogan's Alley was demolished to make way for the Georgia Viaduct, which is a road. In 2018, so 46 years after demolishing Hogan's Alley, Vancouver City Council approved a 20-year plan to transform the area, including the demolition of the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts. And the plan includes the construction of a cultural center on the former site of Hogan's Alley to honor the Black community. Okay, so time check. We are almost at time. I have, I think, 3 more slides to get through, so probably another 10 minutes or so, but appreciate that there might be some people who have a hard stop right at 11. I think what we had discussed in this case is that since it is going to be, it's recorded, that you will have access to the recording to be able to watch the last few minutes if you do need to go. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who was here and made time for this. If you do need to go, and Lorna, I'm not sure if you have anything that you want to share from the For Our Kids side of things before people have to jump off.
Yeah, just to say that this is the first of 3. So if you have to leave in the next 2 minutes, please do check out. There's another session. I think it's in a month, November the 20th, and then the final one will be in January. So if this has been a good start, then please do sign up for those other 2 events. If everybody else is okay to stay for 10 minutes, is that okay with you, Kerry?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine with me. Okay, great. We will keep going. You are good, Marie-Paul? Okay. Okay, so the first of the 94 calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is: we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care. Why is this call to action first? Because according to the 2016 census, Indigenous children account for only 7% of the youth population, yet are 52% of the children in foster care. So holdover of white supremacy thinking will blame the individual families and parents for not being able to adequately care for their children, rather than examining the systemic oppression that forced them to and keeps them in this precarious state. So here's a story of a real family from northern BC that we've been granted permission to share. So both parents are Indigenous and were high school sweethearts. They had a healthy and loving relationship and blossoming careers. They decided to start a family and over time had several children together. Also over time, they realized that all but one of their kids was neurodivergent, so on the spectrum, autism, ADHD, anxiety, those kinds of things. As the kids grew older, it became more difficult to manage, and the parents reached out for help and tried to find support services. And they reached out for help, and they reached out for help, and they reached out for help. For one reason or another, they were not able to access any support. The only option they were offered was a voluntary care agreement, meaning the support they were offered was to place their kids with another family, possibly even separating them. So they said no. Then life became extremely hard. The father witnessed a traumatic event at work, and the stress of everything sent him into a spiral. There was one event of domestic violence, and then the mother kicked him out. She asked again for support by way of respite care or emergency funding for childcare, but was denied. She was told she should leave her home and take her children to a transition house. Then, using the circumstances of these events and the mother's attempts to get support against her, child welfare removed her children, citing she was unstable due to her emotional state. And the family that the children were placed with, they received financial support and respite care as part of caring for the children. So Dr. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, has said that part of the legacy of residential schools referred to in the TRC is the chronic lack of adequate, equitable services and education for children on reserve, which essentially funnels them into foster care. And according to the Canadian Child Welfare Research Portal, nearly half the instances of Indigenous children being removed and put into foster care were attributed to neglect. Now, neglect in this case is often due to living below the poverty line. So why are so many Indigenous families living below the poverty line? Because from before this country was founded, our systems were designed to keep Indigenous people impoverished as a means of control. So we have just reviewed a lot of material, and that said, there's so much more that I could have and should have included when talking about racism in Canada, colonization, and the impacts of both. If we had more time, we could have discussed topics like the 231 calls for justice and the final report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, racism in the healthcare system and the In Plain Sight report, COVID and the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in prison, Islamophobia, and the impacts of intergenerational racial trauma. There's so much to take in, so much unlearning and learning to be done, and so much accountability, justice, reparations, and reconciliation to happen. It can be overwhelming at times, but for collective healing to occur, we must keep moving forward. We must keep opposing racism wherever we find it. We must commit to being anti-racist. So as we wind up our discussion around the history and current impacts of systemic racism in Canada, I want to leave you with a call to action. So please take a moment to reflect on the following questions. What historical event that we reviewed will you further research? And then what actions will you take to support that community in an act of reparations? So if you're comfortable doing so, I welcome you to share your action in the chat or out loud. And thank you everyone so much for your attentive listening and approaching this material from that learning zone, that learning space. I know this was a lot of heavy content to take in. And if you're a member of MAR, I look forward to hearing more about your research and reparations action in the community.
Thank you, Kerry. That was amazing. Yeah, just take a moment, everyone, if you want to put some comments in the chat for those questions, or any feedback or any thoughts, final thoughts you're having.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was a lot of information, and I appreciate how much work you've put into that and how much you've given us there. And thank you for your framing. Thank you for presenting that in such a kind and gentle way. Really grateful.
Oh, well, thank you everyone for making it to the end. I do hope that you found this session informative and transformational. The recording, as we said, will be available for you to review in the next couple of months as we go through the series. And in our next session together, we'll talk about how racism shows up in your teams and what you can do to address it. So if you found this session impactful and would like to discuss bringing this to another audience, feel free to reach out to us. We bring our workshops to PACs, places of employment, communities, events, that kind of thing. And so now for anyone who has one and has time to stay, I would happily take questions or comments. So is there anything that anybody would like to clarify? Before I open the floor though, just want to bring everyone's attention back to our group agreements of respect, recognize, keep, listen, ask, and practice the pause. Okay, so questions, comments. Oops. Can I make this chat box bigger? Oh, and Jinhua, was there any questions that you caught earlier? Because I won't be able to scroll all the way up.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, and also I just want to say thank you, Mary Paul. If anybody has been listening to French, we'd love your feedback of how that went, because that was the first time we've done that. So we'll be sending out an email with the recording, and then there'll be a chance to give us some feedback of how you found the event. And yeah, as Kerry said, please do come along to the next two. So they'll start to look more about, well, how do we start applying this with our teams? And that's all. You can sign up now. It's all on our events page. Yeah, so if you've got a comment or question, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand, or, just take a moment. That was a lot to take in, so take a breath.
Oh, yay. The live interpretation was perfect. So appreciated. Yay.
Amazing.
Wonderful. I don't think that there's any questions that have come in, unless I've missed one. But yeah, make sure, please drink lots of water today and take time to ground yourself, whether that is with a walk or a nap or a hug or whatever is helpful for you, because that was a lot to take in.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming and committing your time to this. Sorry that we slightly overran, but we really appreciate your commitment to this. And thanks again, Kerry, and thanks, Marie Paul. And hopefully see you all for the next session. Thanks, everyone.